Welcome to the Unlist. So a lot of you have been clamoring for the server room. You're like, where's the server room? Where's the server room? I want to see the server room. Because I used to do a lot of my live streams from the server room while I was at work. But you have to understand this was during the pandemic when things were quiet and I could have more time sitting at a desk watching cameras for like an hour and a half to 2 hours rather than being outside and patrolling the whole time. But since, the world has effectively woken back up and things have gotten busier and there are things going on now, I no longer really have the time to commit to a session, on live stream. Not that there will never be live streams again. There will be live streams, but they're much rarer, and I usually end up being a guest on somebody else's live stream. So I just can't find the time to do them myself like I used to. However, all the old ones are still on Instagram. You can watch them if you want. I'm not going to delete them, but times are just much tougher now and much busier. So doing these videos for you at about 15 to 25 minutes a piece are much easier because I don't have to do them at work. And if I do them at work, I can do them in different locations. Plus, I can do them at my house, in and around my neighborhood, while on walks, stuff like that. However, since a lot of you have been going, where's the server room? Where's the server room? Ta-da! I'm in the server room. So congratulations. I'm using up my lunch break to do this for you. So I hope you enjoy. Now, today's episode is going to be about tobacco fragrances. Not as much to say about tobacco as there is about other subjects in perfume, just because tobacco, as we know it, is typically just tonka. There, I've said it. Show's over. You can go home now. You can leave the server room. Tobacco, as a subject, is typically achieved just by using a heavy dose of tonka in the base. That's it. That's all she wrote. Sign off. This has been another episode of the Unlist. Anyway, so the reason why is pretty clear if you understand anything about how tobacco is made. So, tobacco is a cured product, just like leather, okay? Tobacco plants are grown, the leaves are plucked, cut, whatever, pulled, and then the tobacco is usually sun-dried, which gives you a certain kind of flavor. Sun-dried tobacco tends to be used in cigarettes. It's just plain tobacco. It's not really treated with anything. It's just sun-dried. Or we can do what's called kiln-dry. And when you kiln-dry tobacco, that's when you can introduce flavorants and things like tonka. And tonka beans were traditionally roasted with the tobacco leaf to smooth and mellow out the flavor of the tobacco and give it a pleasant, slightly sweet aroma as well. And that tobacco tends to be what you find in your like your Swisher Sweets products, your Dutch Masters, things like that. You also find it in your snuffs and in your Copenhagen dip chew tobacco flavored with tonka. Likewise, you also see tonka cured tobacco turn up in pipe tobacco, which then can be flavored additionally with vanilla, with cherry, grape essence. A lot of your Dutch Masters, your cheapo cigars, are flavored strawberry, grape, whatever, okay? So now you understand. So being that tonka is effectively tobacco adjacent, since tonka is a primary traditional ingredient used to cure tobacco itself, perfumers just kind of go, all right, well, that's obvious. We'll just use tonka. And it depends on what kind of tobacco note they want to achieve. If they want more of that cigarette, cigar-style tobacco, they will typically pair the tonka with other things that impart a dryness and ashiness. So a lot of your 80s tobacco fragrances that tend to smell smokier, more like a cigarette burning on the lips or a cigar club or something. They use stuff like clove, which can be smoky in certain contexts, vetiver, certain kinds of vetiver, can also be smoky. You may even see things like birch, which is adjacent to leather fragrances, because birch, if you remember episode 17, birch is a material that was used to create Russian leather. So birch has a bit of a crossover. You may also find it in some tobacco fragrances because it imparts that smoky nuance as well. And then other tobacco fragrances that are going more for that pipe tobacco, more for your sweetened, again, Dutch Masters, cigarillo style tobacco, they will usually take your tonka and pair it with something like vanilla. Now, back in the day, before we really had ethyl maltol available to make super sugary fragrances, before Angel by Thierry Mugler and stuff like that came around, the only way you were going to make tobacco sweet at all was to put other notes around it that kind of impart sweetness. So you see a lot of floral notes turn up, vanilla turns up, things like that. But even those are not sweet in the way that you would think of today's super sugary Tom Ford Tobacco Vanille or Paco Rabanne 1 million style tobacco fragrances. That is a whole different phenomenon. And while I'm not the biggest fan of those super sugary ethyl maltol tonka bomb style tobaccos, I do own 1 million. Okay, I like some of them. I've got Eau de Bal, which Eau de Bal is actually a precursor to Tobacco Vanille. It came out before, and honestly I think it's better because it has a peppery note. If you want to think about Tobacco Vanille meets Spice Bomb, merge them together, but make it older than either of those, which is hilarious, but it came out before those, yet it smells like those combined. That's kind of what L'Occitane Eau de Bal is. And that's one I can tell you to run out and try if you like the idea of a little bit of a more vanillic pipe tobacco, like a Tobacco Vanille, but infused with a red hot pepper note. Just boom, right there, Eau de Bal, pretty good stuff. Back on track though. So the history of tobacco fragrances really actually starts surprisingly with the women's market. Men didn't really have an interest in smelling like tobacco back in the 19th century because they already smoked the stuff. Men smoked, pipes back then. Cigarettes weren't really popular until the early 20th century because people had to roll their own cigarettes and that was tedious. So the only people who really rolled cigarettes in the 19th century were cowboys, ranchers, people who were ne'er-do-wells, right? People on the lower end of life, where they would just buy, bags of tobacco and they'd get papers because paper was cheaper. Paper was cheaper than having leaves to roll tobacco and make cigars with. And they didn't have a pipe handy because, they're out in the wilderness, right? They're out in the prairie. So they would effectively borrow the French model because the French are what started cigarettes, by the way. It was started in France. So they would just do the French thing and just grab some papers, put tobacco in there, roll the papers, lick it, smoke it. But that wasn't something that the common person in your more urbane environments would do because that was tedious. So they just pipes, stuff like that. So guys didn't really want to smell like tobacco in those times because they were already surrounded by it. I mean, cigar clubs, gentlemen's clubs. You could smoke anywhere you wanted to in public back then, especially in the 19th century. Geez, I mean, it's between horse manure and chimneys pumping out creosote and freaking people smoking tobacco everywhere. I mean, air was kind of noxious, right? So the last thing you want is a fragrance that smells like the air already smells. It wasn't until the early 20th century that tobacco notes really became popular with women's fragrances because women generally didn't smoke. It wasn't considered womanly or effeminate for a woman to smoke. So while some did, it was generally avoided. However, with the advent of pre-rolled cigarettes, like the Pall Mall cigarettes, for example, they were the first pre-rolled sold in the UK, sold on the Pall Mall, as you might imagine. The Pall Mall cigarettes, which were rolled to order back then, you bought a little cigarette case, a little metal case. You go to the Pall Mall shop, they would roll them for you. It was really expensive too, by the way. Off you go, fancy cigarette case. It became fashionable for women to smoke because now with the uniform look of those pre-rolled cigarettes, the little plastic Bakelite filters that they would put the cigarette on, very elegant, very chic, okay, very stylish. So suddenly, it was cool for women to smoke cigarettes. Therefore, it would only make sense that they would want fragrances with some tobacco nuance in them. Maybe not the whole point of the fragrance was tobacco, but having a tobacco-like note in there was okay. And one of the earliest tobacco-themed fragrances was a Caron fragrance released in the early 20th century called Tabac Blonde. Funny thing was, Ernest Daltroff, when he created Tabac Blonde, he figured guys would like it more. So while it wasn't necessarily gendered, it wasn't a men's release, it was thought to be more for men. As it turns out, since women were now buying cigarettes and smoking them like crazy, you know, they were going towards Tabac Blonde, and it was more of a woman's fragrance. So after some time, Ernest Daltroff kind of threw in the towel and said, okay, it's a woman's fragrance, we'll market it that way. And then he went back to the drawing board, and it would be 20 more years, but eventually he would make another attempt at a fragrance that was more conducive to the male taste. And when he would do that, he would go out of his way to make sure people knew it was for men. And that fragrance is Caron Pour un Homme. So Caron Pour un Homme, released in 1934, specifically and very explicitly labeled as For a Man, was created as a reaction to the failure of Tabac Blonde being adopted by men. Boom. There's your bit of knowledge for the day. With Tabac Blonde, and later we would see things like Habanita from Marugia come out, it was becoming more trendy for women to have a tobacco-themed fragrance, but men eventually kind of took it back, you know, because into the mid-century, we started to see fragrances get more conceptual, you know, more abstract, because aroma chemicals and materials were more advanced. Perfumes were getting more complicated all the time. More science worked in, so allowed for more artistic expression. So we would see things start to include tobacco notes. A lot of them were tobacco plus this, tobacco plus that. We didn't see a lot of directly tobacco-themed scents, though. I mean, Old Spice was effectively a men's market adaptation of early American Old Spice. It had a tobacco note in it. Surprise, surprise. Even though it's more of an amber oriental style fragrance. Most famously, though, the very end of the 50s, we would see a fragrance called Tabac by Maurer and Wirtz come out. And that was another oriental style fragrance. It was a tobacco plus leather plus spice. It was kind of an amalgamation of things. It had your bay rum notes in it. It had your carnation notes in it. It was a bit of a mixed bag, but it was named Tabac because the primary thing you're supposed to notice is, oh, tobacco, right? That was the primary thing. And a couple other men's fragrances up until that point also toyed around with some tobacco notes. The fragrance That Man by Revlon had a Tabac note listed in it, although it was more of an aromatic chypre, a bit of a fougere crossover too, but more of an aromatic chypre fragrance with the tobacco notes in it, or the Tabac notes, as the I have the pamphlet for the old 50s bottle, and that's how it declares it as Tabac instead of tobacco, whatever. So tobacco fragrances, in terms of the focus being more strongly about tobacco, really didn't start coming into vogue until the 70s, though. We would see things like, well, you know, Ocendre by Giacomo. We would see Avon would come out with Hollande in 1970. We would see Etienne Agenais from 1976, #1. That was more of a, again, a tobacco plus something else, so a leather tobacco mixture kind of a deal. And then, of course, those really smoky, realistic, backroom jazz club kind of fragrances I mentioned earlier in this video, like the ones that had clove and vetiver to create more of a smoky, tobacco being consumed kind of vibe. Those came in around the 80s. So we would see Giacomo de Giacomo in 1980. We would see Open by Roger Gallet in 85. We would see Montana Parfum d'Homme in 1989, I believe. Edward Fleischer. Davidoff would most famously come out with a tobacco-themed fragrance because Davidoff sold cigars, right? So that fragrance, just called Davidoff, from 1984. Another one, goes really heavy on the tobacco notes. Then into the 90s, we would see things get a bit more complicated again. Although one of my favorite tobacco fragrances would also launch in 1994. Two, actually, of my favorite tobacco fragrances. We would see Havana by Aramis in 94 and Dolce & Gabbana, Pour Homme, in 94. Aramis was kind of a culmination of all the things that was going on in the 80s. So Havana had the smokiness, the backroom essence, the Cohiba cigar being smoked, that whole thing. But then it also mixed a bit of the boozy elements. It was really trying to put you into a Copacabana kind of vibe, where you're in the club, you're in Havana, pre-Fidel Castro, so we're talking, you know, mid-century Cuba. You're there, you're sipping on a Cuba Libre, so you got the Coke and rum and the lime wedge in there. You're smoking the Cohiba. Life is good. I mean, people's life in Cuba itself wasn't that good, but you're a tourist, you don't care, right? It's kind of how that was. That's the kind of aesthetic you're getting from that fragrance anyway, is that pre-communism era of Cuba. That's what they were shooting for. Bit problematic, I guess, in modern perspective, to theme a fragrance like that, but 94 folks weren't really caring. Especially because in 94 we were kind of still at odds with Cuba anyway. So that fragrance, Havana by Aramis, really kind of put a exclamation point on that more lucid, realistic style of tobacco, because you had your Cohiba cigar notes, you had your smokiness, your vetiver, your spices, you know, the rum notes, and the effervescent, bubbly, semi-aldehydic introduction, which is kind of like the Cuba Libre, the Coke, and the lime. It's just kind of like perfect. You know, it's kind of a perfect fragrance. The other fragrance from that year, also from, you know, again from 94, Dolce & Gabbana Pour Homme. That fragrance signaled a new era for tobacco because, as you know, a lot of countries, specifically in the United States though, but elsewhere as well, smoking indoors was becoming outlawed. It was no longer cool to smoke inside, or even legal to smoke inside in some places. So suddenly tobacco fragrances had to get a lot cleaner. So the focus began to pull away from the smokiness, began to pull away from the spiciness, and we're now looking at the leaf, the sun-dried leaf. You know, like we're at Philip Morris, we're at their Virginia tobacco fields, and we're just smelling the leaves sitting over the little thing being dried out. And that kind of dry, leafy tobacco feeling was really demonstrated almost academically in that Dolce & Gabbana Pour Homme fragrance. They also put some fougere elements in there as well. There's lavender, there's bergamot oil, there's lemon, okay. There's oak moss in there. So it's not strictly tobacco, I know that. Before any of y'all come for me, I know it's also a bit of a fresh fougere and a tobacco mix. We would see that continue though with stuff like Versace The Dreamer in 97, which was another floral, clean, white musk kind of tobacco fragrance with actually a pretty interesting iris note. Last time I saw like iris paired with tobacco was way back in 1970 with that Avon fragrance, Avon Oolong, but that was a sweeter, more bay rum kind of fragrance. Here with the Dreamer, we see like a naked iris ionone worked into some creamy white musks, that clean floral feeling, Lilial and Lirol playing their part, and then that dry, leafy tobacco right underneath. In the end of the 2000s, we would see tobacco fragrances get more gourmand. So we would see the vanilla come in, the benzoin, the amber, okay, orange oil crept into some of them. Famous example of that would be Baldessarini cologne, okay, and then there's a concentrate as well. But the Baldessarini cologne was another early clean tobacco style, but it was a much more gourmandy, much sweeter style. And then, of course, one of my favorites from that early 21st century period would be Michael for Men by Michael Kors. That's another tobacco plus because there's leather in that fragrance, there's plum note in that fragrance, there's a cognac note in that fragrance. So really, Michael for Men by Michael Kors is kind of like you're sitting in a drawing room wearing a smoker's jacket, like you're Raja Dove himself, okay, sitting there with your little velveteen jacket on, and you're smoking, you're drinking some Crevassier or something while you're having your cigar. You've got leather shoes on, or you're sitting in a big back leather chair. It's that whole, like, you know, Midnight Theater presents, I'm reading a book kind of thing, right? That's, you know, a little hat tassel like Ebenezer Scrooge. That's the kind of vibe that Michael for Men was trying to give you. And it succeeded, and it's one of my favorites. Then that takes us to the modern era, where I described the sweet, the ethyl maltol, the real heavy bubblegummy stuff. Those kind of tobacco fragrances are barely such, but some of them are good. I mean, London by Burberry is pretty good if you like a cherry tobacco. The 1 Million by Paco Rabanne, extremely sweet fragrance, but it also has some complexity to it. If you microdose it by like 1 or 2 sprays max, you actually get a more feeling of what that fragrance is supposed to be, rather than just going and, you know, fumigating the club out with that thing. But those kind of tobacco fragrances are sort of wearing out their welcome with some people in the community. I get it. They're sweet. They're heavy. They become really more about the tonka than they do about the actual tobacco note itself. They're more just heavy-handed tonka and sweetness. Exceptions being Spice Bomb, very dry, spicy, obviously, of course, spicy fragrance with a nice leather and tobacco combination. And then more recently, we have some things like the Aramis Tobacco Reserve, was really nice. Harkens back to more of that cigar-style tobacco with the tonka and the dry notes and the leather notes. And then, of course, Zaharoff, which was the subject of my previous video. Zaharoff has some tobacco-themed fragrances as well. Zaharoff has Signature Tobacco, which is kind of a bit on the sweet side, but I wouldn't necessarily call the Zaharoff Signature Tabac as a sweet tobacco. It's sweet-ish. It's like the Aramis Tobacco Reserve. There's a bit of sweetness, but it's not punching you in the face. And then Zaharoff also has this leather tobacco, which I haven't smelled, so I can't really speak on that yet. But that's the newest shindig in the tobacco world. And that's it, guys. The moral of the story here is, circle back to the beginning, tobacco fragrances are really just expositions built around tonka. So if you don't like tonka in its many treatments and forms, if you're not a tonka kind of guy or a tonka kind of gal or a tonka person in general, you don't drive a tonka truck, you're probably not going to like tobacco-themed fragrances. Just putting it out there. And with that, hope you enjoyed the server room. Hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The Unlist. Have a good one.